The Dead Rising series is a fascinating downward spiral, a cautionary tale of what not to do when given free reign of a video game franchise. A mere glance at my channel should be enough to figure out that I like talking about Dead Rising. If you've watched these videos, it should also be very clear which of the games I preferred over others. Reviewing them in order without having played the entire series beforehand probably shaped my critiques in those early videos. Perhaps it was for the better. There's sort of a sincere and wholesome way I approached 1 and 2, as I was oblivious to the blunders later on in the series. It's almost like the audience got to join me as I went along, the dramatic irony building all the way up to the final game. If I had only known how bad it would get. It also could have been for the worse. Perhaps if I had played the whole series beforehand, I would have been able to better articulate why the first 2 games are as good as they are. However, when it comes to the DLCs of Dead Rising 2, Case Zero and Case West, it's clear to me that holding off until now was definitely a positive. If I had played and reviewed them in release order along with everything else, I don't know if I would have come away with the conclusion I have now. I would of course talked about a few of the changes and what I liked about them, mention some of the new combo weapons, talk about the level design, and call it a day. My, at the time, 100 or so subscribers would have been thoroughly whelmed, and I'd add another video onto the pile of content that is my YouTube channel. But now, after a long absence from the series, playing Case Zero and Case West provided me with some much-needed clarity. They've helped me find the answer to the question I asked back in my Dead Rising 2 critique. What made Dead Rising great? That's a question I do intend to answer, but not yet. Until then, strap in, because you're in for a weird review, one that I guarantee will surprise you at least once. Both Case Zero and Case West are fairly unremarkable, and honestly, I personally wouldn't recommend either of them unless you're desperate for any sort of Dead Rising content that isn't outright garbage like 3 and 4. I'll give them that. Both are better than the 3rd and 4th games by a country mile. Part of the reason is, of course, they're still Dead Rising 2. Looking back, it's pretty ridiculous how much Blue Castle were able to milk out of this one game. The prologue teaser DLC Case Zero, the main game of Dead Rising 2, the epilogue DLC Case West, and the remake director's cut Off the Record. To me, that's kind of absurd to think about for a couple of reasons. The first being that I vastly prefer the very first Dead Rising made in-house by Capcom over everything else in the series. Maybe it being a standalone game, one so easily placed on a pedestal, is a good thing, but imagining a world where that got the director's cut remix treatment akin to Off the Record has me salivating at the thought. The other reason I think Dead Rising 2 getting milked so hard is wild is the simple fact that I hate every main game after it with a passion. Dead Rising 3 makes me sick just thinking about it, and Dead Rising 4 has me feeling a mixture of complete boredom and utter contempt for the bastardization of Frank West. There was a clear and defined line in my head where Capcom Vancouver went completely off the rails. With the addition of these 2 DLCs to the mix, it now makes me think the studio subconsciously knew Dead Rising 2 was as close as they were getting to being competent replacement developers of anything labeled Dead Rising. However, even in these DLCs, there's some sinister foreshadowing going on. Some changes that frustrated me in later games of the series seem to have had a trial run in these bits of added content, and some core elements of the franchise were already absent, leaving me with the idea that the once clear divide between good and bad Dead Rising is a lot less clear now. I definitely recommend watching my previous videos on the series, as this is essentially the Dorkaxe culmination of everything Dead Rising. With that in mind, we can start with our first DLC review of the video, Case Zero. This DLC takes place a few years before the events of Dead Rising 2. I'm not going to go through the whole story, since it just feels so pointless for such a small amount of content. The gist is that Chuck and Katie are trapped in this small town of Still Creek. In 12 hours, the military is going to arrive and will capture Katie since she's infected. So before then, Chuck has to find 5 vehicle parts so they can escape on the motorbike he found. That's as much as you're getting for plot, but I will talk about some of the cutscenes in a bit more detail. I mentioned in my Dead Rising 2 video that I didn't much care for Chuck besides when he was interacting with his daughter. Well, thankfully, that's basically all that's in this DLC. Every cutscene with Katie is genuinely great, and it always paints Chuck as a great father. For example, him trying to convince Katie that a whole 12 hours is a long time between shots was pretty cute.
You won't have to take another one for a long time. A whole 12 hours.
At first, I didn't understand why she was so against getting the Zombrex shot in the first place, since I figured it was a mundane event by now. However, that's only before I realized that this is probably her first or second shot ever. They were just coming from the Las Vegas outbreak, where she got infected, so her reaction makes sense. It does seem rather concerning that Chuck leaves her all alone in the gas station to go explore the town for Zombrex, but I guess that's something we kind of have to overlook. When you walk away from her, she has a tendency to hum and sing to herself, which is adorable. Near the end of the DLC, when you give her the second Zombrex dosage, there's a particularly harrowing moment where Katie asks why her mom bit her.
Daddy, why did Mommy bite me?
That wasn't Mommy, sweetheart. It just looked like her.
That's honestly pretty heart-wrenching stuff. It's a bit of a shame these moments are locked behind this DLC, shackled to the Xbox console. In Dead Rising 2, the mother was hinted at being a zombie, but I'm almost positive her being the one who infected Katie wasn't mentioned. For the level design, I was both impressed and tremendously let down. There are lots of boarded-up buildings, which is lame, and quite a few barren as hell interiors that are laughably bad. That being said, the layout was pretty easy to remember, and there was quite a lot of that trademark vertical freedom that I love so much. Getting into the gun shop requires some creative roof climbing, as well as getting into the hotel to find the key to the shed. There's also a high-up sword, which is really well placed, as it's more than just a good weapon hidden in a hard-to-reach location. If a player didn't figure out how to get into the gun shop with the plethora of swords in there, they can still complete the quest where an NPC requests a sword from Chuck, which is required to see the ending. It is a shame the gap to get that sword is incredibly finicky, however. Overall, there weren't a whole lot of secrets, and the ones that do exist you can pay to learn about at the pawn shop after you rescue the owner. I was worried it would be difficult to pay for everything I wanted at the pawn shop, but smashing the random slot machines and doing a specific survivor quest will net you plenty, enough that you can easily afford the extra Zombrex, and even a moose head or electric rake. You'll also need to buy the motorbike wheel for $5,000, which is fine since you get loads of money anyway. The survivors are what you'd expect. You can escort them back to the hub gas station once you found them. I'll talk about survivors as a whole later on in the video, so stay tuned for that spicy take. But for now, I'll just say that all of the Case Zero survivors are pretty good. One requires a few drinks to come with you, which admittedly is pretty strange, since all you need to do is grab 2 alcoholic beverages that are literally right next to him. After you save both of them, Gemini has an additional request to find her missing gems, which can be found back at the quarantine area. She gives Chuck a lot of cash for returning it, so it's definitely worth doing. The 2 girls in the bowling alley make you go look for their friend before tagging along, which you then need to carry. This one is really aggravating on a second playthrough, since if you choose to save yourself a bit of time and grab the lady in the quarantine tent first, you'll be shocked to find that she isn't there. The bloodstain on the ground where she eventually stands is there, but she won't be until you finish the dialogue with the other 2 friends. This is the kind of thing that really irritates me, especially for these quasi-open worlds that Dead Rising offers. Consistency and immersion are key. I already have to accept that survivors only show up at specific times of the day and are nowhere to be found until then, but the game not even loading in a survivor that should be there at that time because you didn't finish the dialogue with the quest giver is dumb. Anyway, she requires Zombrex to go with you, which is actually something I don't love. This goes for being able to buy Zombrex at the shop as well. If you had played this DLC before the main game, you now already know Zombrex will be something you won't always have access to. It's a gameplay mechanic in and of itself, not always tied to the story, and you'll now know that survivors can sometimes ask for them. The only Zombrex dosage you need to keep Katie alive during this DLC is required via storyline cutscene anyway. Imagine if that was the only time it was mentioned in Case Zero, just the cutscene acquiring it and the ones where Chuck administers the shot to Katie. I think that would have been a very interesting surprise for players going into Dead Rising 2. Zombrex at that point would have only been a storyline device, not something tied to gameplay decisions. Even the introduction in Dead Rising 2 has you follow a set story quest to find your first dosage. This might lull the player into a false sense of security, and maybe end in them not thinking about it while they go through the story, only for them to panic when it gets closer to the deadline. Subverting player expectations is one of my favorite things in video games when done well, and the only times it can be done is when the player is either familiar with the series, the game, the genre, and so on. These opportunities don't come around often, so it's a shame they threw in the survivor needing Zombrex and the pawn shop allowing you to purchase Zombrex in this throwaway DLC. This was meant to be somewhat of a marketing tool for Dead Rising 2 though, which is likely why it's in here. There's 4 more savable survivors left, 2 biker boys gush over seeing Chuck Green, and you trade a sword for the final bike part. I liked seeing people know who Chuck is and not be instantly antagonistic or convinced he caused an outbreak. It really gives us the feeling that he was famous. Finally, we have our replacement to the transceiver, Bob Blackrock. He's an obvious contrast to the sniper bosses in Dead Rising 2, which makes him really interesting. This is an example of properly subverting player expectations for the next game. You've had a sniper ally on a rooftop helping you out before in this DLC, then in the main game, the snipers are your mortal bane. Besides popping off some zombies, Bob is your main quest giver. He flags the player down to tell them of any survivors he's seen. It is a little awkward that you have to climb up to the roof to talk to him every time, but you don't have to do it too much, it's a short game. He's trying to find his daughter, which only becomes rescuable at 7 PM, 2 hours before the military arrives. This kind of reminds me of the Anju and Cafe quest in Majora's Mask, where you're teetering towards failure, the game forcing you to wait until the brink of defeat to see the quest through. It's not quite as dramatic, as you can do it immediately once the zombie nighttime cutscene ends, but I would imagine most players would see this after the end boss fight, which could be awfully close to 9 PM. They also might miss it entirely, since you can leave right after the boss fight, which can only trigger after the Zombrex dosage with Katie, which can also only happen at 7 PM. Even though that brink of failure last second aspect of the Bob and Darcy quest is nice, everything surrounding it is kind of annoying. Bob says he's found his daughter in his own shop. This happens the moment 7 PM hits, which is already silly since if you waited next to Bob the whole time, it's pretty clear he stood in the exact same spot, meaning there's no way he saw her there. It's also ridiculous as if you don't talk to him yet and walk into the shop, she isn't there. The moment you do talk to him, she spawns and you can move on with your life. And of course, even though Bob told you to go see if she's okay, when you talk to her, she won't go with you because her dad is overprotective. So you have to go back up to Bob. He says he's got his eye on you and will now come with. Of course, their reunion hug needs to happen as well, which also eats into your time. On one hand, this could make players feel anxious, as they're ever focused on how much time is left before the military arrives. However, the dumb back and forth being what drains your time remaining isn't a very interesting usage of the time element. After you get the bike parts needed, Chuck can construct his bike. However, regardless of how early you completed it, you can't leave until Katie gets her Zombrex at 7 PM. I think this makes sense, although I could see how some people would be irritated at having to wait around to finally finish the DLC. After the dosage, a boss fight occurs with this doofus. Not much to say, he's very similar to your average boss fight in Dead Rising 2. Oh wow, I really didn't have much to say, I guess that's it. Finally, Chuck escapes from the military on his new motorbike. This section kind of blows, which is unfortunate because I actually really like escape sequences in video games. The controls feel pretty limp, but this is to be expected as it's simply Dead Rising 2's bike controls, just applied to a different context. Before moving on to the Case West DLC, there's still the gimmick of Case Zero that needs some discussion. Whatever levels and skills you've acquired through your time playing, with a level cap of 5, get carried over to your save file in Dead Rising 2. Around this time, the Xbox 360 Marketplace was really popular, and download-only titles were becoming more prominent. I don't know if a lot of publishers just had the same idea, but the gimmick of a pre-game DLC which carried over progress was used for a few other games in 2010. NBA 2K10 had the Draft Combine, and Fable 2 had pub games. Since I'll never get a chance to talk about them in any other video, really quick, only allowing you to take part in 6 drills with your player in Draft Combine is silly, since that doesn't emulate what players go through at all. You could argue you're choosing which skills your player is best at to get good marks on the scouting report, but there's a big reward for getting gold in them, and it gives you experience, so it definitely seems to be emulating a real practice drill. You also have no idea what the drills even are before playing them, and some are much more difficult than others. Shooting around is easy as pie to get gold in, as well as the stealing drill, since you can just stand in front of the off-ball player and the ball handler still throws the pass like an absolute dingus. But the challenge shot one is ridiculously inconsistent, and can even subtract points, even if you played as stellar defense as you possibly could have. Finally, the attack the basket drill just emphasizes how fucking awful layups feel in this game, since no matter what, if you get caught in a contested shot animation, that ball will never go in that basket. I remember this being an issue with the real 2K games as well, which is just frankly absurd. I understand wanting to give the defense ways to impact the game, but the fact that the ball will almost never go in, even though you're right there, is ridiculous. This is a simulation basketball game first and foremost, and this isn't how it works in the NBA at all. When it comes to the actual gameplay, the input buffering is god-awful, oftentimes causing you to pass the ball the moment you've received it. Layup packages are a joke, resulting in some hilariously dumb-looking layup attempts that don't make any sense for the situation. The momentum system in this game is bafflingly stiff. If you have a 2-on-1 fast break, passing the ball may cause both of you to stop dead in your tracks, ruining the easy bucket. Finally, the steal button is essentially just a foul button, as it never fucking works. Why can't a player attempt to steal the ball without either a whistle being blown or the player doing some dumb animation? I hope the 12 of you out there who were hoping I would talk about an NBA 2K game appreciated that. Fable 2 pub games is kind of dog shit. If you had pre-ordered the main game through certain retailers, you got this for free, so it isn't a huge deal, I guess. You gamble through a few minigames, then whatever money you've managed to earn in total is yours to start with in the beginning of Fable 2. There's a few cosmetics and other items you can earn as well. I played a lot of this when I was younger, since I was so incredibly excited for Fable 2, but good lord, as a standalone game, not worth it. Out of all three of these pre-DLCs, Case Zero is at least kind of worth playing, if only for the cutscenes with Katie. It being arbitrarily locked to the Xbox seems pretty strange, but for how small of a dedicated fanbase Dead Rising has, and how little this DLC really adds to anything, I'm not sure if we're ever gonna see this ported to the PC. Case West has the same circumstances, however it is a bit meatier and more polished, so it is a shame you can't play this on PC. The canonical ending to Dead Rising 2, where Chuck and a zombified TK are locked in an elevator together, is the lead-in to this DLC. Seeing Frank West and Chuck Green at the same time genuinely gets me really excited. They're like the Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock of Dead Rising. Their head-to-head and off the record, even though the boss battle wasn't as good as it could have been, was my favorite moment of that game, which is why I made that the thumbnail for my video on it. So anyway, Chuck is about to get bitten by TK, Frank makes the rescue. Their interactions are pretty great overall, but I especially like how Frank helps Chuck up, to then only push him back down when he realizes it's the guy who has supposedly caused the outbreak. Frank was apparently going to investigate a phenotrans facility with Rebecca, who is dead in this timeline, remember. Chuck takes her place as Frank's partner, and the facility is the setting for the entirety of the DLC. I have a few quibbles about Rebecca and Frank already having planned to investigate the phenotrans facility on their own, due in part to the existence of Off the Record, and how Rebecca was behaving in the original Dead Rising 2. In Off the Record, Frank seems pretty surprised to see Rebecca as a big-named reporter for Channel 5 Action News. I'm sure Off the Record Frank and canonical Case West Frank had different experiences between the first game and now, but still. The other reason is simply how Rebecca was acting in Dead Rising 2 itself. I can buy Frank wanting to check out this facility given who his source is, but Rebecca seems like a stretch. She was completely dead set on her story that she was fed, where Chuck caused the outbreak. Once her eyes were opened a bit more, she was willing to hear the true story. However, she still didn't mention phenotrans at all. She only figured it out at the very end, right before she was shot. I just don't really buy her and Frank going to investigate a phenotrans facility together, but it's not something to spend a minute talking about. Definitely not. I definitely wouldn't waste anyone's time talking about such an insignificant supposed issue such as this. Anyway, Frank and Chuck sneak in through the vents, Frank puts his ass into Chuck's face, and they fall through and need to fight off zombies. As much as this long-winded introduction may have proven otherwise, I'm not going to focus on the story or any major plot points. Mostly because there isn't much beyond everything I said. Frank and Chuck go on a few scavenger hunts based on what their source tells them, do a few tasks here and there, meet the source and the Phenotrans lady, then at the end a boss fight happens and brappadoo, there's your DLC. There are a few cutscenes that I liked quite a lot though, mostly because they showed how funny Frank and Chuck can be together.
You know, you're a little high-strung for a guy who's covered wars.
My favorite one is the first time they encounter armed guards. Frank isn't as naive as Chuck is at this point, so when Chuck pulls his "hey buddy," Frank isn't too pleased with the results.
Hey, buddy!
Who the hell are you?
Listen, you just keep quiet, all right? We don't want to hurt. Oh, shit.
There's a nice subtle twist near the end, since they keep referring to their source being a he the whole time, but it ends up being Isabella, which is kind of neat. The amount of zombies in this facility seems kind of ridiculous at first, but the reality is that Phenotrans have been using prisoners, the homeless, and missing people to turn into zombies to harvest queens so they can make more Zombrex. Pretty messed up. I think this honestly makes Dead Rising 4 make a little bit more sense in retrospect. I was pretty sad that the developers threw in cloning as the new method of creating zombies without much being said on the ethics of cloning and all that comes with it. However, that seems like a natural end-state progression given the zombies' humble origins. Third world country on accident in an attempt to double meat production for the US, then US on accident, followed by the US on purpose but in secret with supposed undesirable people as their guinea pigs, and in Dead Rising 4, on purpose but with cloned humans. One could also argue that since their goal with the experiment in the first place was to increase meat production, maybe cloning cattle was their method. It definitely doesn't make Dead Rising 4 amazing or anything, believe me, but the cloning doesn't seem as out of place when looking at the whole zombie timeline in this universe. Moving on from the story and characters for now, the gameplay is overall pretty decent. You play as Chuck throughout the DLC, with Frank as your buddy tagging along with. He can be playable in co-op through online, but I don't have Xbox Live, and I don't even know if it's possible anymore at this point, so I never got a chance to try for myself. The AI seems pretty competent, thankfully, so it didn't end up bringing down the experience by any means. He even puts on outfits if you tell him to. What a good sport. He also seems to be invincible, which is probably for the best due to the limited inventory of a Dead Rising game, and how abhorrently cheesy the enemy design in this game is. I'll talk about that later on, though. For some reason, Chuck can take pictures with a shitty camera. There's just no reason for this to be in the DLC besides a terrible attempt at giving fans what they wanted. I understand I played off the record before this DLC, which one may conclude is the reason I can't appreciate the existence of this terrible camera. However, I would still think it's a cheap knockoff even if Off the Record never existed. I would also imagine they knew Off the Record was coming out in a year, where photography would have a real comeback, so why not hold off a little while longer? Hearing this disposable camera take pictures, and knowing that it's Chuck behind the viewfinder is pretty sad. I'm assuming their thought process behind giving Chuck a camera was as simple as this. We want anyone playing as Frank to be able to use his camera. We don't want the players to have different capabilities. Let's give Chuck a camera. However, that could have been a great incentive for people to play online as Frank. If that was the only way you could use the camera, the real camera, it may have invigorated the online. I have no idea if that's even how the co-op functionality worked or if that would make sense, but with my understanding of how a few other drop-in, drop-out multiplayer games work, it seems like it would have been a good fit. You can take pictures of the PP stickers that are plastered around again like in the first game, so the camera isn't entirely useless, I guess. Another collectible around the facility are the security cameras, which you can shoot down. Besides offering you some experience, there's not really a reason to interact with them. They don't seem to connect with the enemies or attack you or anything. I do like hearing Chuck's voice lines when he destroys them.
Show's over. Can you see me now? Good night, big brother. I don't like being watched. It's not nice to stare.
But there are way too many scattered around for it being so worthless. I don't see the purpose of the cameras existing. The survivors this time around aren't able to be escorted back to the safe area. Instead, you save them from a group of zombies or otherwise bring them a certain item or two, then they run off on their own. I suppose it does make sense, as they definitely know this facility more than Chuck or Frank do, and there really isn't an obvious safe room. There's a sort of hub area where you talk to Frank's source, grab orange juice, and shoot Marion on the TV, but I'm sure the employees of this facility don't really want to hang out in this random room with these two strange guys who just broke in. Even though it makes more sense than it would otherwise given the setting, it's still not as enjoyable as escorting survivors yourself. If we can confidently attribute this critique of the survivors' behavior to the facility itself and its layout, I'd say that teeters the level design as a whole into the negatives. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly not all bad. In fact, comparing it to Case Zero, it's almost as if the two DLCs swapped their strengths and weaknesses. There aren't any inexplicably inaccessible buildings or rooms. The interiors of every area house a lot of items and are sometimes uniquely furnished. Both DLCs offer a few secrets and unlockable doors, as well as plenty of vertical freedom to find items and shortcuts. However, where Case West's level design falls short for me mostly has to do with how homogeneous everything looks. Let me be as clear as possible. I think Case West looks miles better than Case Zero, both graphically and stylistically. Shiny metal just looks better than run-down cement. However, because it's in a clinical, science-y building, there's just not a lot of room to make certain places in it look distinct. All of it being smushed together in random right-angle boxes doesn't help the situation. Again, this makes sense because of what this building is. It certainly feels believable, but as a Dead Rising environment, it's just not that interesting. I could potentially see this working better if it were a longer game, as you'd naturally become more familiar with things, but as it is now, it's very easy to get lost when not looking at the guide arrow. The seemingly nonsensical upper walkways in a few areas don't help the issue, and neither do the enemy soldiers that pester you wherever you go. The enemy design is probably the worst part about this DLC. The zombies are of course here, as are the steroid gas zombies from Dead Rising 2, but now there are various humanoid enemies all over. I think the enemies with melee weapons aren't too bad, but the gun-wielding soldiers are ridiculously annoying. There are so many of them in certain sections, they can gun you down when they're perched on a seemingly unreachable walkway, and they use flashbang grenades that stun. I genuinely have no idea what Capcom Vancouver were thinking. The shooting mechanics flat out aren't good enough to make these sections work at long range, and at close range they stun lock you so hard and gang up on you with grenades. The amount of them clumped around the middle walkway area, again, makes sense, as this seems to be where they store their weapons and equipment, but for gameplay, having this many of these stun-lock flashbang dinguses in a single area only causes frustration. Compare this to the soldiers in Dead Rising 1. They're not a regular enemy by any means, they're only there to make the last part of the game more varied while raising the stakes. They're also spread out enough so you can ambush one or two of them before a whole squad begins firing. It's embarrassing how often Capcom Vancouver get outclassed by the in-house Capcom team. Thankfully, there are quite a few nice items and combo weapons to find in this DLC, which can alleviate some frustration found with the enemy design. The Zap and Shine was pretty entertaining, as well as the Impact Blaster, but even a few of the non-combination items were welcome. A giant syringe that can be used as a javelin is great, but best of all, my favorite thing to use in this DLC, hands down, was this Segway vehicle thing. It's the perfect balance of being both useful and goofy as hell. Lastly, we have a boss fight with this commander guy. He's a pretty decent boss fight, since his attacks are well telegraphed, he has 3 health bars which makes the fight last long enough to feel climactic, and he has an interesting visual design. My main complaint would be, of course, the extra enemies that enter the room after a while. I understand wanting to give the player some of the soldiers' weapons to use against the boss in case they need them, but these enemies aren't fun to fight, and if the player already had a decent loadout going in, they may end up wasting them on these goobers. Afterwards, Marion claims that there is a cure that exists already, but they haven't released it to the public yet as it wouldn't be as profitable as selling Zombrex. I think that's genuinely really silly, but considering that Dead Rising 3 exists, I can feel more at ease knowing she was just lying to make Chuck angry. I know Case Zero had a lackluster escape event to finish it off, but seeing that the Phenotrans facility was going to self-destruct got me really excited. Unfortunately, there's no escape sequence, just a cutscene showing Chuck and Frank outside. I think riding on a Segway through zombies could have been a fantastically hilarious and semi-serious moment all at once. It's a real shame. If you want to see how it might have played out, consider playing the Newgrounds game Segway of the Dead. Like I said earlier, what these 2 DLCs really provided me with was some clarity on what it means to be a good Dead Rising game. Neither Case West or Case Zero are competent mini-encapsulations of the heart of this franchise, as both lack fundamental qualities that made the original and the sequel as great as they are. Case Zero has a lot of buildings that you aren't allowed to enter, some ridiculously empty interiors, not a whole lot of unique assets or items, the only boss is entirely forgettable, and the color palette is incredibly boring top to bottom. Case West has a setting that is made confusing to navigate thanks to how homogeneous everything looks, the rooms aren't connected in an interesting or memorable way, the survivors can't be escorted, and there are humanoid enemies all over, further encouraging the player to use guns. That last one is critical, as exploring the mall and Fortune City was made enjoyable and somewhat relaxing by two qualities. One, the great soundtrack was always present to keep you grounded in this world, but more importantly, two, the zombies were mostly all you had to worry about. After a while, the raincoat cultists would populate the mall, but they wouldn't aggro you until you were pretty close, and even still, they mostly had melee attacks and were only present for a certain amount of time. I've talked before about how, in the original game, the tone would shift dramatically back and forth between high-intensity psychopath bosses and cutscene story events to low-intensity and almost peaceful exploratory sections. That balance is imperative to what the first game was and still is to this day. When you add in shooty enemies that can fire at you from anywhere, you detract from the fun of exploring at your own pace. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. Adding in enemy variety and more challenging obstacles to get the player out of their comfort zone can definitely be a positive, but we have to approach every game individually. For the speed and combat of Dead Rising, the soldiers are just terrible. The boarded up buildings in Case Zero reminded me of Dead Rising 3 the moment I saw them. I understand how difficult it must be to create a believable sized setting, then allow players to enter into every single building. Of course, even then, you would still want the interiors to be more interesting than a few slabs of blank wall. It's certainly not an inherent flaw if a video game world is on the smaller side, especially considering this is a DLC, but because it's so tiny, you would expect more effort to be put in to assure the buildings are explorable and varied. This wouldn't be as much of an issue if the first Dead Rising didn't set the bar so high. Future games in the series should at least be on par with the level of detail that was put into this world, and allow players the freedom to explore every building. Again, I know that's easy to say, but that was one of the most unique aspects of Dead Rising, that the mall existed like you'd expect it would in real life. Not being able to get through security gates makes some sense, while not being able to bust down thin pieces of board or a window doesn't. Of course, there are also the security cameras and non-escortable survivors of Case West, which should be very familiar to anyone who has played Dead Rising 3. The security cameras are entirely superfluous, which is bad in the squandered potential side of things, but not as detrimental as the survivors. I am convinced now more than ever that escorting NPCs is integral to the Dead Rising experience. I could go on about how they're one of the best open-world collectibles I've ever seen in video games, and even when their AI is a buggy mess, the challenge of rescuing everyone in the mall aids the idea that you're enacting real positive change in the world around you. However, all of that being said, the positive qualities don't even matter in this instance. Yes, I like them, I think they're a great idea with fairly decent execution in previous games, but they're also one of the few core elements of this franchise in the first place. Think about it. What makes Dead Rising different from other games? What about it separates it from other zombie titles? The use of wacky items and weapons, the non-linear and believable world design, the campy story, multiple endings allowing you to keep playing the game after you failed the story, the time limit mechanic, and the rescuable survivors. Those last three are just as important to the experience as the former four, but as time went on, Dead Rising 3 and 4 decided to ditch the time limit idea, the failable story, and escortable survivors to the detriment of the franchise. After all, Dead Rising 4 has a campy story, it has wacky combination items, it has a non-linear world, but most, if not all, would agree that game is fucking terrible. Dead Rising 3 also lacks those things, and that world design I couldn't even classify as believable. Yes, I still think Dead Rising 3 is worse than 4. Don't get me wrong, the quality of these factors plays a big role as well. The story in 3 and 4 is much worse than in 1 and 2, and the quality of the open world in 3 and 4 are far worse than 1 and 2 as well. You could even argue the use of wacky items is less encouraged, since finding guns that pack a punch is incredibly easy. Something you could never say about Dead Rising 1 is that it's generic, but the more you remove tenets of the franchise, the less it resembles itself. Play Dead Rising 4 for a while, and you'll find that it's essentially a third-person shooter. However, this wasn't a sudden shift. I'm sure you're all familiar with the boiling frog analogy. As far as I'm concerned, Dead Rising 2 placed the frog in the pot, Case West turned up the heat, Dead Rising 3 turned it to high, and finally, in the wacky adventures of Hank East, the frog is burned alive. Being encouraged to grab grenades and guns to fight off faraway soldiers is about the most generic gameplay scenario you could possibly think up. We should at least be thankful there's a few human enemies that don't have guns, I guess. Well, there you have it, folks. My thoughts on the final bits of Dead Rising content that I hadn't talked about yet. I promised twice before that I'd be done talking about this series, and I've been shown twice before to be a complete liar. I'm not going to make that same promise this time. The fact is, there honestly is more I could talk about. If you could only see how much longer this script was before I decided to cut it off here. Maybe sometime in the future I can revisit Dead Rising once again, but for now, I think I'll give it a rest. Thanks for watching, everybody. You can support the channel by giving me a few bucks on Patreon if you're so inclined. If my content is worth your money, great, but if not, perhaps like the video and subscribe. It's always nice to have some discussions in the comments section as well, so let me know what you think about these DLCs, this series as a whole, or anything else really. I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Thanks for watching.